Welcome to Medcan Presents our Health and Wellness webinar series. My name is Christopher Shulgin. I'm part of the team that creates content at Medcan. Just while people are coming in and joining us, we'll start with a poll that talks about people's movement relative to the pandemic. So the poll is, how much physical activity are you getting now relative to before the pandemic? Option 1 is, I'm exercising and moving around much more than I did before the pandemic. Option 2 is, my overall activity level is about the same. Option 3 is, I'm conducting much less physical activity relative to before the pandemic. And then option 4 is, my activity level hasn't changed at all. Go ahead and respond to the poll as people are coming in. I'll just take a second to mention that we'll accept questions about all of this at the end of the presentation. You can ask questions through either the Q&A button on the screen or through the chat function. Today's webinar is the new 24-hour movement guidelines. Canada's first ever all-day movement guidelines have just been released, and they feature important implications for the way we all manage our physical activity. Public health exercise guidelines used to limit themselves to suggesting a minimum of 150 minutes per week of moderate exercise, but as science recognizes the importance of physical activity, the evidence suggests we would all benefit from incorporating movement throughout our days. Dr. Peter Nord, our host today is Dr. Peter Nord. How are you, Peter?
I'm well, Chris. How about you?
I'm great. Dr. Peter Nord is the Chief Medical Officer at Medcan. Our guest today is Dr. Robert Ross of Queen's University. Dr. Ross, how are you today?
I'm doing very well, thank you, Chris.
Okay, I'll walk through, Dr. Ross, I'll walk through your bio. So you were the chair of the consensus panel that wrote the 24-hour movement guidelines, which were released in partnership by the Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology, the Public Health Agency of Canada, Queen's, and ParticipACTION. Dr. Robert Ross is a professor in the School of Kinesiology and Health Studies and Department of Medicine at Queen's University. Dr. Ross has published more than 230 papers and book chapters, and he is a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences, the American College of Sports Medicine, the American Heart Association, and the Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology, where you are also a past president. Dr. Ross, how is your activity level relative to before the pandemic?
Oh, actually, the pandemic hasn't affected it very much at all. In fact, it's given me a little bit more time, a few less meetings at the office, having to work remotely. So it's part of my behavior, it always has been. And so the pandemic hasn't affected it very much at all.
Okay, we'll give about 10 more seconds for people to respond to the poll. Dr. Peter Nord, how is your activity level relative to before the pandemic?
Yeah, it's probably overall about the same. It's just different. You know, I typically start my day in the gym, and with the gyms being closed on and off, it's required a bit of creativity. So my wife loves walking. So we are now starting every morning, we're out there for an hour, rain or shine, and getting an hour's walk in. And we live in a condo, so a bit of stair running and resistance training in the stairwell is what it's come down to at this point, to stay isolated and distance from everybody and still try to get some fitness level in.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll and then share the results. So how much physical activity are you getting now relative to before the pandemic? So 17% said I'm exercising and moving around more than I did before the pandemic. 45% said similar to similar to Dr. Ross, that my overall activity level is about the same. 37% said I'm conducting much less of physical activity relative to before the pandemic. And then 1% said my activity level hasn't changed at all. That's fantastic. I'm going to stop sharing the poll and hand it over to Dr. Peter Nord.
Thanks, Chris. And again, welcome, Dr. Ross. Fascinated reading these guidelines. The first 24-hour, I think, underline 24-hour guidelines. I think that's one of the big takeaways. But I was struck by how some of the aspects of the guidelines are similar in terms of that 150 minutes per week. And yet there's some things that are different as well. So some things stay the same, some things are different. And, you know, you certainly added some color, some texture to those things. Why did you feel the need, or why did the team feel that on a consensus perspective, you needed to even consider the revision? And, you know, in addition to the revision, why now? So why the revision, and why now?
All good questions. All good questions, Peter. We've known for a long time that the behaviors that make up our day, physical activity, sedentary behavior, and sleep, in and of themselves, all have an independent association with a wide range of health outcomes. That's not new. What is new in the last decade or so is the observation that the integration of those behaviors affects health outcomes. So because they make up a 24-hour day, if you change one behavior, you necessarily change another. So the question becomes, well, is that good, right? So rather than isolate any single behavior, the 24-hour movement guidelines, the principal or fundamental assertion is that the integration of those behaviors are very, very important. So that's the basis, or what underlies the rationale for generating 24-hour movement guidelines. And the adult guidelines that we have just recently released a few weeks ago really complete the family of 24-hour movement guidelines in Canada. So the first for the early years, then children and youth, and now for both adults aged 18 to 64 and older adults 65 years and over. So we're quite proud of that in Canada. They are a world first, to be sure, but more importantly, they really reflect common sense. And I think they provide options to Canadian adults to seek ways to make their day their best day, or to make, as we like to say, the whole day matters. And I think that that's the underlying message, and we hope that that resonates with Canadians.
Yeah, I know. I used to regularly see advertising on TV and radio about ParticipACTION. In building on that work from ParticipACTION over the years, again focusing on young people, how is the process? How are these guidelines actually developed?
Well, it's quite a rigorous process. It took a consensus panel of international and national experts 3 years to tease through the evidence, evaluate the evidence, and to generate the individual recommendations for all of the behaviors for 2 sets of guidelines that make up the 24-hour movement guidelines. So we follow, not to dig down too much into the weeds, but we follow what I think are the consensus is, the agree to tool that is used to develop guidelines is the process that we followed. And then once you have the individual recommendations, then you have to grade those. And we used actually grade to go from evidence to decision. So we think the publications, the systematic reviews that we did followed the guidelines that people like yourself would expect us to follow. Very rigorous process that takes a while. So to come to the fruition of those labors on October the 15th was quite an exciting time for us, because that hard work, and now we have the fruits, and now it's time for the very important work of dissemination and implementation of those guidelines, making Canadians aware. That's why we're very happy for this opportunity to do exactly that.
Yeah, really exciting. You mentioned the international consensus panel. How does Canada stack up against some other countries around the world in this area?
Well, as I said, we are the first country to develop 24-hour movement guidelines for adults. Guidelines from other countries have still resisted that temptation. They're still isolating either physical activity, or as the guidelines released a couple of years back in the United States, they now incorporate recommendations for physical activity and sedentary time. So the other countries are catching up. Catching up might not be the best way, but perhaps better said, following our lead. And more countries now are starting to recognize the evidence that's growing almost monthly suggesting that the integration of behaviors is far better than the isolation. So we still stand out, but other countries are following the lead, and we think that they will have 24-hour guidelines for adults very, very soon.
That's great. So obviously leaders in the area, and I think one of the interesting takeaways that I after reading the guidelines is those three sort of big buckets. The physical activity, that I think people can get their minds around, but focusing on the non-physical activity, that sedentary lifestyle, and then also if you can't get a good night's sleep, none of it really matters. So having the kind of the balance between all of those seems to be critically important. And of course, when you started this journey, you couldn't have anticipated the effect of COVID on our society. Clearly, a lot more screen time. We're doing these sort of things remotely. We're all working way more virtually than we were even a year ago. So the concept of screen time, being sedentary in front of a screen, is taken on all sorts of new meaning in this time. So it seems like those are those three buckets that are very, very innovative, I think, in looking at activity guidelines.
Well, I think, Peter, I've often been asked, is it unfortunate that you released the guidelines during a period of COVID where the news cycles are appropriately dealing with a pandemic that has serious consequences, no doubt. But I'm quick to say that I think, Peter, the opposite is true. This is a time when Canadian adults worldwide, but certainly Canadian adults feel depressed or mentally challenged, the loss of control, the isolation, what will happen with my job? But all of these stresses are very, very real. We also notice that very strong determinants of COVID are having overweight or obesity or type 2 diabetes. Well, I think the guidelines present two real opportunities here for Canadians. One is the recognition that all forms of physical activity provide benefit. So they don't have to go to a special gym. They don't have to buy special clothes or do special things. The guidelines recognize for the first time, just for example, that light physical activity, walking as you do with your wife in the morning, is an outstanding physical activity behavior. People that do that should take note of that. I think it's an empowering observation. It allows adults to take control at a time when control is hard to manage in this period of COVID. So by being physically active, by reducing sedentary time, you're doing very, very good things for overall health and well-being, both physically and mentally. And I think those are messages that are very appropriate during COVID. And I think the guidelines provide the targets and they provide the tools that Canadians use to address physical activity and sedentary behavior. So I think the fact that we're released in the time of COVID provides opportunities.
Yeah, I would agree. And that's one of the reasons why we're excited. Obviously, many of our webcasts have focused on COVID in one way or another, the good, bad, the ugly, the hope for the future. And so interesting times to have these come out at a time when actually we need them more than ever. And especially for somebody like me, I mean, historically, if I haven't got my heart rate at 140, then I'm not working out. So for those of us that are walking with a much lower heart rate, it's still reassuring that the benefits are there. Maybe you could just spend a couple of minutes and go into a bit more of the specifics of the guidelines and get everybody a bit of a sense for what is the detail, a bit more color around those three big areas. And then maybe we can, after that, talk a little bit about the non-adult population and some of the variations on the theme for those subpopulations.
Sure. Well, as you say, the guidelines can be, I guess, parceled into three basic behaviors. So physical activity is the one that probably most Canadian adults and practitioners are most familiar with. And with respect to moderate to vigorous physical activity, the type of physical activity that you described that you enjoy participating in, the guideline is the same. The target remains 150 minutes accumulated throughout the week. However, one big difference in the guidelines for moderate to vigorous physical activity is we have now removed the requirement that that physical activity be acquired in bouts of 10 minutes or greater. The evidence now, the empirical evidence for that requirement was always rather soft, and now the evidence suggests that that's not required. So I think that opens up, again, opportunities for Canadian adults to acquire moderate to vigorous physical activity. But the other arm of physical activity, the one that we described, this is a first. This is a first to make the recommendation that light physical activity is associated with benefit across a wide range of health outcomes. So this is the activity that we often describe, Peter, as activities of daily living, that perhaps Canadians never thought that that was beneficial in terms of physical activity, that they had to do that. I have to get my heart rate up and I must go to a gym. Well, we know that that's no longer true. So walking, as you do with your wife in the morning, walking with the family during these times, respecting social distancing to be sure, but just walking, doing the household chores, cutting the grass, these kinds of things we identify. So that intensity is very low. That's possible to do. So if Canadians are unwilling or unable to do moderate to vigorous, light physical activity certainly is beneficial. For sedentary time, we're recommending 8 hours or less. That's what the evidence is suggesting of sedentary time, best described as sitting, watching television, recreational screen time, or even what I'm doing right now, sitting in front of my screen talking to you. This is sedentary behavior. So we're recommending that sedentary behavior be broken up as much as you can. Get up, speak to someone, walk around the room if you can. So 8 hours with 3 hours of recreational screen time. Try to target that as the maximum within a day, which many Canadian adults will recognize that's a challenge today, but we do our best. And with sleep, these are the first ever, believe it or not, first ever guidelines at all from any jurisdiction for sleep for Canadian adults. And that's the recommendation is 7 to 9 hours for adults 18 to 64 and 7 to 8 for adults 65 years and over. But two key things that I'll finish with, Peter, with respect to the guidelines. Two very important recommendations that are inserted right within. One, that any movement towards any of the targets is beneficial. There's no threshold for benefit. So say someone can only do 30 minutes in the whole week of moderate to vigorous physical activity. Give yourself a hug. Congratulate yourself. Well done. You can only do a few hours of light physical activity in a day. Good for you. Good for you. Well done again. Right? So any movement towards the targets is important. And on some days for Canadian adults, that might be all they can do. Perhaps they're shift workers. Perhaps socioeconomic status doesn't allow them to buy the type of equipment that allows them to ride bicycles or go to the gym. That's okay. So in that way, I think, in short, the guideline recommendations provide options to Canadians. They provide targets, to be sure, but if those targets are unattainable in any of the behaviors, any amount that you do is good. And I think we have to take heart in that. I think we have to advocate for that, I think, a lot better than we have in the past. So we've written that right into the guidelines so that Canadian adults understand those messages. I think it's very, very important. And finally, I think another message that we as a guideline development panel seek to promote is that these guidelines, I think, because they provide so much flexibility and so many options, speak to individual Canadians. It's not one size fits all. Any Canadian adult could look at those recommendations and say, on this day, this is what I can do. And I know this is associated with benefit. Bravo. Well done.
That's great. Yeah, certainly in preventative medicine, we think about exercise as a prescription at times too. I'll think about it as the medical, the psychological benefits that come from exercise. So it sounds like there's almost a pretty good dose relationship between exercise and some of the outcomes that you talk about in the guidelines, sort of, you know, lower to higher. So there's no lower limit. And obviously there's a higher limit at some point, but clearly kind of a dose relationship between exercise and the benefits of exercise.
Oh, exactly. We've known that there's this negative inverse dose response relationship where going from nothing to just doing a little provides the biggest impact with respect to improved health. And that, as you say, is a novel insight on a threshold-based or prescription-based observation, where we normally use exercise as a performance-based activity. But when we look at a health-based prescription, it's very, very different. And I think the guidelines reflect that. And as you say, it's not threshold-based. There's no lower limit for benefit. And I think that's positive news. Again, an empowering message.
Yeah, great takeaway. So that's the adult group. What about at the younger age and the over 65 crowd? I mean, in the over 65, falls alone. So, you know, falls in our seniors population take such a toll in terms of, you know, in Canada, we have over 100,000 hospitalizations every year for seniors that are falling. And exercise is one of those ways that can help even prevent that. So I know the consensus panel looked at sort of that seniors group and then the younger folks as well. How did those two populations differ?
Thank you, Peter. You remind me of course, a physical activity that I omitted to speak to, and that's resistance type exercise. There's also a recommendation for both adults age 18 to 64 and adults 65 years and older. That's essentially the same, to do your best to perform resistance type activity at least twice a week. So I had forgotten to mention that, and I thank you for the reminder. And that's particularly important in the older population. One of the few recommendations that's unique to the Canadian adults 65 years and older is that they perform physical activities that challenge balance for the very reason you mentioned. So the resistance exercise and the activities that challenge balance are so very important for older adults, to allow them to maintain independent living, as you're suggesting, to allow them to maybe withstand a fall on black ice that's typical, right? And so rather than be under house arrest for 4 or 5 months, we try to encourage, right? And it's difficult for some, try to encourage resistance type activity and activities that challenge balance, to do that very thing that you mentioned, Peter, to be able to withstand falls if you do fall, or hopefully upstream of that, prevent falls at all. So those two guidelines are also within the 24-hour movement guidelines, but specifically the balance recommendation is specific for older Canadians.
Terrific. And then for the younger population, kids and youth?
We also have 24-hour movement guidelines for both the early years and then children and youth. And essentially, they're saying the same thing, right? It's been the notion that the integration of behaviors is far more important than the isolation of any one behavior. And that's particularly important with early years children and youth, where play is such a vital message. Getting outdoors, finding ways to be just physically active any way you can. So I think that 24-hour movement guidelines that we've had for many years now, 4 or 5 years for children and youth and for the early years, are underscored by the same premise. Again, integration, reduce sedentary time, increase physical activity behavior, get good sleep. That's intuitive, makes good sense, regardless of age.
That's great. That's probably a great way to summarize all of it. Maybe we'll hold here and turn it back to Chris for some Q&A.
Fantastic. Thanks so much to both of you. So I am going to share my screen, and we're just going to summarize the guidelines. And folks, a couple of people have asked, where do we get these guidelines? So honestly, the easiest way is Google 24-hour movement guidelines and it'll come up. It's on the Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology webpage. There's a remarkably great website about it that goes into specific guidelines for each different age group. And there are, Dr. Ross, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are also guidelines for pregnant women. There are numerous different guidelines for various sub groups of the population.
That's right. Yeah, that's right, Chris. So as you say, just csep.ca, you can go there and you can toggle across the top, see guidelines, toggle on guidelines, and you're brought there immediately to see all the various guidelines that CSEP has been responsible for producing.
Okay, before we get to specific questions, which there are numerous ones, and thanks a lot, webinar attendees, for using your Q&A function or the chat function to submit questions. I'll just run through a quick synopsis of each of the guidelines. So Canada's first ever 24-hour movement guidelines: move more, add movement through your day, including a variety of types and intensities of physical activity and muscle strengthening activities. Aim to accumulate at least 150 minutes per week. And those who are 65 and older should also include physical activities that challenge balance. Reduce sedentary time. So limit sedentary time to 8 hours or less per day, including no more than 3 hours of recreational screen time, and break up long periods of sitting where possible. And the sleep box. So sleep well. For those aged 18 to 64, set yourself up for 7 to 9 hours of good quality sleep on a regular basis, and 7 to 8 hours for those 65 years of age and older. And consistent bed and wake up times are key. Okay, specific questions. And I'll just add, we do, so we archive these presentations on Medcan's channel, YouTube channel. And we also, in the mail out, we'll mail out the link the next day. And we also, in that mail out, include the deck that I just walked through. So Dr. Ross, one question is, what is the best form of resistance exercise for 70-year-olds? Do you want to take that one?
Well, the best, the simplest answer is any form of resistance type exercise that you're going to do on a regular basis, right? It is unlikely for many of our seniors that you will be able to, certainly during the time of COVID, get to a gym, or even for many have the disposable income to join a commercial fitness center. So using your own body weight, using rubber bands, using chairs, using cans of various weights. There are numerous websites that provide, I think, very, very simple, very, I guess, straightforward resistance type exercises that seniors can do. And if someone wants to send me an email, I can redirect them to those sites.
Dr. Ross, can you speak? So one aspect of physical activity, particularly for seniors, that has been gaining a lot of credence lately is low weight, high reps. There seems to be a lot of interest and a lot of science being done on that. Can you talk about that for resistance training as well as possibly for aerobic activity?
Well, I think if both of those physical activities will be good, regardless of age. Any type of activity that you're doing that's going to stimulate movement in any form is going to be associated with benefit. And I think that's one of the very positive messages that we're saying. So light physical activity may be described by some people by doing high numbers of repetitions with a certain type of exercise, right? Their heart rate may not be elevated, or they may not be profusely sweating during that particular exercise. But what the evidence clearly says is that is of benefit, right? Because all of those activities are aerobic, obviously, even though they're doing some resistance exercise. So I would encourage that exercise as a component or as a modality, right? A vehicle by which any Canadian adult who fancies that type of exercise would want to do. I encourage that. I applaud it. And I think people who do that should take heart in the fact that that's associated with benefit.
One of the questions that has been submitted is great because I think it pertains to a lot of different people, particularly for people who are working at home in the pandemic. But so it's hard to avoid the fact that my screen time is much more than recommended because of work. What do you recommend I do? Is there any way to mitigate the negative effects? And these are the people I think who are often on Zoom calls for 8 hours, sometimes at a time. Maybe there's a quick half-hour lunch break, but what do you suggest those people do, Dr. Ross?
To the best of their ability, find ways, to break up that time, right? So we said when people at work, go to the water cooler, right? When you have a quick meeting with someone, walk up the stairs, right? To go and meet with that person rather than do a quick Skype call or telephone call. Find ways of breaking up that sedentary behavior as best you can, because that's associated with benefit. There's no question about that. And the guidelines address that very notion. It will be difficult for some. It will be difficult for some to attain those targets. Some people often ask me, well, what about an occupation, right? A truck driver or someone like that who's sitting down much of the day. We understand that. So that recommendation might provide a challenge to that particular individual. So they can focus on some of the others. Maybe it's moderate to vigorous or light physical activity when they're sitting, getting good quality sleep. Again, providing options for Canadians that on any one day, they have a number of vehicles to alter their movement behavior. Another way of simply saying that the whole day matters.
Fantastic. I think this, Dr. Peter Nord, I think this is a question that you probably get from your patients a lot, but is there a relationship or is there a scientific body of research on the relationship between immune function or the strength of the immune system overall and frequency of exercise or type of exercise? By which I mean, can exercise stimulate the immune function? And if you're looking for ways to fight off COVID, is exercise an option for you? Or can you speak to that at all, Dr. Ross?
Yeah, so no way to know for sure. Number one, defining immunity is really hard because it's extraordinarily complex. And for sure, during COVID, we're still learning. So we haven't seen any studies that talk about, exercise and tying that to immunity and tying that to protection. So the answer is we don't know. That we were saying that quite a bit over the last 8 months, but things like exercise creates something called demarginalization. So when we exercise, there's increased numbers of white blood cells that can be circulating in our system. And white blood cells are an important part of immunity. So we know that from a physiological perspective, some of these things are great. Like our bodies were meant to move, and their bodies clearly from the guidelines are meant to move most of the time. And so what we've been finding out is that, generally exercise is a good thing even from a disease prevention perspective. So, and the guidelines speak to some of that as well. I mean, cancer, GI, orthopedic, like all of these things. And what was interesting is a number of years ago when we looked at high performance, high aerobic activity, so like marathon runners, they actually got sick at a greater frequency than people that were exercising in more moderate way. And so there's probably some sort of a bell curve in terms of the relationship between intensity of exercise and our susceptibility to fighting off viruses just in general. Some of the work we could say is at the physiological levels, or we can say, okay, this is what's happening in our arteries this is what's happening to our heart, here's what's happening to some aspects of our immune system. It's tough to translate that into a direct benefit. But again, we have noticed that people that exercise to extremes tend not to do that well.
Dr. Ross, did you have anything to say about that?
Not much. I will say that immune function was not an outcome that our guidelines considered. You know, you'd like to do 50 systematic reviews. You can do 10. But I think the literature would basically echo the exercise science literature, what Dr. Nord just said, that certainly physical activity along the lines of those that are part of the consensus recommendations that we just released would be associated with improved immune function, although there's a number of ways to measure that. It gets kind of complex, but it would be associated with improved. Where you see sometimes a deterioration is in what we would call people that are doing extraordinary amounts of physical activity, and that may start to compromise a number of issues. But that certainly is they are doing exponentially more physical activity than we're discussing here. And the other issue I would raise again is that what we know very clear is that physical activity has to be part of a lifestyle-based strategy to address obesity and to address type 2 diabetes. They must be together with, of course, a balanced, healthful diet. The two go hand in hand. So you are, by addressing the guidelines, doing things to address, mitigate the strong determinants of those who do poorly with COVID, right? So I think that it's very, very hard to find an outcome for which physical activity performed along the lines of the consensus recommendations, sedentary activity performed along the lines of the consensus recommendations, and sleep that does anything but good across a wide range of health outcomes.
Fantastic. One last question, because we've gone over our time, so this is more an observation, I guess, or perhaps a clarification. But so these guidelines are hardest for the kids from 5 to 17. 60 minutes of vigorous activity every day, and so when schools are limited. So wow. So for kids 5 to 17, that's true. 60 minutes of vigorous activity every day. I guess we're looking for a confirmation there, Dr. Ross. And then do you have any suggestions on how to get that, particularly today when kids also can be on Zoom calls with their classes?
I'm not an expert when it comes to children, to be sure. I'll preface my comments with that observation, but I don't think it's as difficult as it might appear. I mean, when you incorporate play with kids that are running around all day, when you take recess or lunchtime running around, coming home and staying outside and playing in the park with friends and doing things, it's not really hard to accumulate 60 minutes. Where it becomes more difficult is if the children are not participating in those natural types of activities. But I think that 60 minutes for many, when it comes to children, I know I'm probably the senior person on our panel here, but as I remember growing up, acquiring 60 minutes of running around and playing with your friends, I mean, that we would double or triple that in a day without very much difficulty. So I think that what the message that we'd like with our children is, shut the door, get them outside, go play, find a way to be active outside, and try your best to stay away from all the temptations that I didn't have growing up. And that's, of course, with all of the games and the devices and the screens that we have today are extraordinarily tempting for children. I understand that. That's something we need to overcome. But 60 minutes of physical activity for children is a minimal recommendation.
Fantastic. No, I can, as a parent of young kids myself, I can speak to the dangers of the iPads in terms of limiting physical activity. But this is wonderful. I will wrap things up by talking about some future webinars and podcasts that are coming out. So our next webinar, November 17, Tuesday at 12:30 p.m. is how to prepare for a pandemic winter. Travel options are limited. Many athletic activities are curtailed and stress relieving options are restricted. So what should you do to stay sane as temperatures fall and the winter approaches? Medcan's Eat, Move, Think panel of Director of Food and Nutrition, Leslie Beck, Fitness Manager, Anna Tapali, and psychologist, Dr. Jonathan Danza will provide guidelines and inspiration on how to turn this unusual winter into a healthy, happier one. To register for that, bit.ly/Medcan_winter, bit.ly/Medcan_winter. Find past webinars at Medcan's YouTube channel at youtube.com/MedcanLiveWell. Other resources, this week's episode of Eat, Move, Think, the Medcan podcast is Does Intermittent Fasting Work? Medcan's Leslie Beck interviews cardiologist Dr. Ethan Weiss on the findings of his recent intermittent fasting study. Dr. Robert Ross, thanks for this. Really appreciate it. It's been fantastic. Good luck on your promotional efforts on this. I think you're doing the world a service to evangelize exercise. Thanks very much, Dr. Peter Nord. Thank you for your questions. And thank you as well for your insightful commentary. Gentlemen, thanks very much. And we are going to call it a day on this one as well. So thank you. And thanks to webinar attendees as well.